For decades, Ed and Lorraine Warren were the world's most famous paranormal investigators, the couple behind the Conjuring, Annabelle, and Amityville. They were seen as protectors against the darkness, spiritual warriors armed with crucifixes and faith. But what if the truth about them was far darker than anyone ever imagined? What if the people who claimed to fight demons were hiding demons of their own? In the last few days, shocking new information has surfaced. Sealed interviews, hidden tapes, and statements from former associates that completely shatter their saintly image. Stay tuned, because what you're about to hear will forever change how you see the Warrens. And before we begin, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because this story isn't just strange, it's disturbing. For over half a century, Ed and Lorraine Warren were the most recognizable names in the supernatural world. They were the faces of faith confronting fear, the demonologist and the clairvoyant, battling forces that defied science and terrified millions. To the outside world, they were saviors. Families in distress called them when priests refused to listen, and cameras followed them as they claimed to cleanse homes, cast out demons, and protect the innocent. But behind that carefully crafted image was a growing unease, one that, according to recent revelations, might expose a truth darker than any ghost they ever faced. The Warrens began their journey in the 1950s, long before the term paranormal investigator became a pop culture staple. Ed, a former Navy man with a fascination for theology and the occult, called himself a self-taught demonologist. Lorraine claimed to have clairvoyant abilities, saying she could see entities most humans could not. Together, they toured the East Coast, giving lectures in church basements and college halls about the dangers of spiritual possession. They didn't just investigate hauntings, they monetized fear. By the 1970s, they were the first couple of American ghost hunting. Their fame exploded after cases like the Perron family haunting, later adapted into The Conjuring, and, of course, Amityville. They became living legends, with reporters dubbing them the real-life Ghostbusters. They filled notebooks with sketches of apparitions and recorded eerie voices on reel-to-reel tape recorders. To their followers, these were brave acts of faith. To skeptics, they were carefully curated performances. Now, decades later, newly leaked church documents and unreleased interviews have started painting a new picture of their rise, one of manipulation, exploitation, and hidden motivations. As investigators dig deeper into the Warrens' archives, one question looms large. Were they uncovering the truth about evil or creating their own mythology to control it? In early October, a private collector in Connecticut claimed to have discovered a series of boxes in a long-abandoned storage unit belonging to a well-known paranormal couple. Inside were what appeared to be hundreds of tapes, faded photos, and handwritten case logs, all labeled in Ed Warren's unmistakable scrawl. Within days, paranormal researchers got wind of the discovery, and what they found inside those boxes would shake the legacy of the Warrens to its core. Among the files were unreleased recordings from several of their most famous investigations, including the Enfield poltergeist and the Brookfield Devil Made Me Do It case. But what stunned everyone wasn't what they revealed about ghosts. It was what they revealed about the Warrens themselves. The tapes allegedly contain audio of Ed discussing how to build suspense in interviews, how to lead witnesses into describing supernatural experiences, and even how to edit sound recordings to emphasize demonic presence. There were references to retakes, staged reenactments of exorcisms meant to sound authentic for later lectures or media appearances. A particularly disturbing entry dated 1978 reads, "Lorraine says they believe if they're terrified, they'll start to manifest it themselves. The mind invites the presence to skeptics. That sounds less like a spiritual observation and more like psychological conditioning. The Warrens, it seems, may have understood that fear itself was their most powerful tool." Even more shocking were internal memos from a small publishing agency the couple once worked with. In those papers, editors accused Ed of falsifying evidence, swapping out photos, and mislabeling film rolls to exaggerate the supernatural elements of their investigations. Lorraine, meanwhile, allegedly rewrote transcripts to make the hauntings seem more religiously charged, invoking the church even when no clergy were involved. But perhaps The most alarming discovery was an unmarked tape labeled S-Case, 1973. Those who claim to have heard it describe something chilling, a private conversation between the Warrens and an unnamed government official discussing controlled exposure experiments. It hinted that their research may have once attracted federal interest, possibly under early Cold War psychic studies, programs similar to Project Stargate. If true, it suggests that Ed and Lorraine weren't just chasing ghosts. They were cooperating with an organization that wanted to weaponize belief itself. As these files continue to circulate among journalists and online investigators, the question is no longer whether the Warrens were legitimate demonologists, but whether their entire empire was built on deception, manipulation, and something even the government wanted to keep quiet. When people think of Ed and Lorraine Warren, they think of one word: Amityville. It was the case that defined their careers, the one that propelled them from local ghost hunters into global icons. The 1975 haunting of the Lutz family became a phenomenon, spawning books, films, and endless debate. But now, nearly 50 years later, newly surfaced transcripts and private correspondence between the Warrens and the Lutz family paint a chillingly different picture, one of manipulation, fabrication, and greed. According to a recently unearthed set of audio recordings found in those hidden files, the Warrens were allegedly brought into Amityville weeks after the supposed haunting had ended. By then, George and Kathy Lutz had already signed a deal with author Jay Anson to write a book about their ordeal. The recordings capture Ed Warren saying, "We'll make it real for them. It needs to feel like it's still alive." To some, that sounds like a marketing pitch, not an exorcism. Witnesses who were close to the investigation have come forward, claiming that the Warrens staged several of the house's most famous photos, including the eerie ghost boy image that became a media sensation. One photographer, speaking anonymously, described how Lorraine would call for the spirits to show themselves, while Ed directed lighting and exposure angles like a film set. When skeptics questioned the authenticity, the Warrens allegedly doubled down, threatening legal action against anyone who accused them of hoaxing evidence. Even the church refused to officially validate the case. A priest cited in the Lutz story later denied ever performing a blessing inside the house, calling it a publicity fabrication. In one leaked letter, a Catholic representative wrote, "We cannot confirm their claims. Their involvement appears motivated by attention, not ministry." Despite this, Ed and Lorraine continued to tour, selling the Amityville story as a righteous battle against evil, a story that made them rich, famous, and untouchable. But the cracks had already begun to show. Behind the smiling photos and television interviews, the Warrens were learning a dangerous lesson: fear sells. And from that moment on, every haunting that followed would be treated not as a cry for help, but as a business opportunity. The Amityville case wasn't just the foundation of their empire, it was the blueprint for the deception that would define their entire legacy. By the mid-1980s, Ed and Lorraine Warren were household names. They had published books, filled lecture halls, and were featured in every major newspaper, from the New York Times to the Hartford Courant. They were no longer seen as fringe investigators. They were the public face of modern exorcism. But as their fame grew, something began to shift behind the scenes. The church, once their greatest ally, started to quietly distance itself, and recently uncovered correspondence between church officials and the Warrens may explain why. In a letter dated May 1985, sent from a Monsignor in Hartford to Ed Warren, the tone is cold and direct. "You are not sanctioned to perform rites of exorcism under the authority of the church. Continued use of the term Catholic demonologist will not be recognized." Another document written to Lorraine that same year warned that further public appearances claiming official church support will result in disciplinary review. These weren't just warnings, they were formal disavowals. The church had grown increasingly uneasy about the Warrens' growing appetite for publicity. Ed's fiery temper and flair for dramatics had started to concern local clergy. He would often storm into a home, crucifix in one hand and a camera in the other, recording every whispered prayer and tearful confession. possession. Priests who once worked alongside the couple began refusing calls from them altogether, claiming that faith was being replaced with performance. Even more damning were the whispers of spiritual exploitation that circulated through diocesan channels. Families who had sought help from the Warrens began reporting being charged fees for holy materials or pressured into signing release forms for books and interviews. Several clergy members accused the couple of turning deliverance into theater, and worse, of taking real trauma and transforming it into entertainment. The final break came after a Connecticut case in 1989 when a young boy's supposed possession was turned into a media circus. According to internal notes, church officials were furious after learning that Ed had leaked details of the exorcism to a tabloid. That was the end of their collaboration. The church stopped answering their calls, and yet the Warrens thrived without them. Television crews followed them now. Journalists hung on their every word. Without ecclesiastical oversight, they were free to write their own rules. But the question remained, when the church of all institutions turns its back on you for going too far, what does that say about the demons you're really serving? For decades, Ed and Lorraine Warren told the world that evil lived in the shadows, in old farmhouses and cursed artifacts. But few knew that their own home in Monroe, Connecticut, the infamous Warren Occult Museum, was allegedly plagued by forces darker than anything they'd claimed to confront. And in light of newly surfaced eyewitness accounts and caretaker testimony, it now seems that what the Warrens called a collection of cursed relics might have been the epicenter of something they could no longer control. Multiple former assistants have come forward in the last few months, each telling a strikingly similar story. The museum's energy was volatile, unpredictable, and often terrifying. One caretaker, who worked there in the late 1990s, described how objects would shift positions overnight and how the air in certain rooms grew so dense it felt like standing underwater. He also claimed Ed had warned him never to speak directly near the Annabelle doll or the conjuring mirror. "It listens," Ed supposedly told him, but the new reports suggest something even more disturbing, that the Warrens may have deliberately provoked the items to create manifestations for visitors. In one audio log, allegedly recorded in 1983, Lorraine can be heard praying softly, while Ed instructs someone to keep the tape rolling as loud bangs echo in the background. To believers, this might sound like evidence of genuine haunting, but to skeptics, it suggests staged theatrics, possibly for the sake of documentation, or perhaps to convince future buyers and producers that their stories were authentic. Neighbors also began complaining that strange occurrences were spilling out beyond the museum's walls. Animal mutilations, voices at night, and even unmarked vans parked nearby at odd hours. Some now believe that government officials once came to observe the museum under the pretense of safety inspections. What were they really looking for? And if these accounts are true, what did the Warrens have that was important enough for federal agents to monitor? By the time Ed died in 2006, the museum had been quietly shuttered by authorities citing zoning violations. But insiders insist that wasn't the real reason. They claim items were confiscated and sealed in undisclosed storage facilities with no public record of their final locations. Some whisper that among them were objects that never should have existed, including something referred to in Warren's final logbook as the shadow vessel. Whatever was inside that house, whether haunted or fabricated, it consumed the Warrens' lives. And now, decades later, it's coming back to haunt their legacy in ways even they couldn't have predicted. As the Warrens' fame grew, their inner circle became a revolving door of volunteers, assistants, and self-proclaimed researchers. But what many didn't realize was that working for the Warrens wasn't a dream job. It was a nightmare. Over the years, several former assistants have broken their silence, and what they describe paints a deeply disturbing picture of what life behind the scenes was really like. One former employee, who used to catalog artifacts at the Warren Occult Museum, said the couple was obsessed with dramatizing every case, even when evidence didn't exist. Ed would tell us, "Make it look good for the papers," she recalled. She also described nights when Lorraine claimed to channel spirits for reporters, only to be seen whispering triggering cues to Ed moments before. These sessions were allegedly staged with hidden speakers and rigged electrical devices to make objects move on command. Another researcher came forward claiming that some of the Warrens' infamous demonic recordings were actually edited composites of ambient sounds, a mixture of static, slowed-down animal noises, and human voices distorted through old reel-to-reel machines. They were masters of atmosphere, he said, and they knew fear was the best marketing tool. But perhaps the darkest claim came from a man identified only as David, who joined their team in 1992. He stated that during a private investigation in Rhode Island, the group was encouraged to provoke any spirits present, shouting insults, breaking furniture, and recording every moment. When nothing happened, Ed allegedly fabricated EVPs using pre-recorded audio. David's statement also revealed that Lorraine became increasingly unstable after each investigation, often collapsing or claiming she was under psychic attack whenever skepticism arose. The most shocking allegation, however, is that the Warrens may have covered up an incident involving one of their protégés who suffered a psychological breakdown during an exorcism. According to leaked police reports, the man went missing for several days and was later found in a nearby forest, disoriented, rambling about a presence that followed him home. He claimed the Warrens told him to stay silent and never speak of what he saw. These former insiders all describe a similar pattern: fear, secrecy, and manipulation used to maintain the myth. For years, they stayed quiet, out of loyalty or fear of ridicule. But now that Ed and Lorraine are gone, they're ready to talk, and their stories threaten to dismantle everything the Warrens built. When Ed and Lorraine Warren passed away, their archives were supposed to preserve decades of paranormal history, thousands of case files, recordings, and classified correspondences. But what many people don't realize is that half of those records mysteriously vanished shortly after Ed's death. Researchers who have tracked the paper trail claim that the disappearance wasn't accidental, it was deliberate. According to several insiders, someone wanted those files buried, and they were willing to go to extraordinary lengths to make sure that happened. Former employees who worked in the Warren home say that after Ed suffered his stroke in 2001, men in suits began showing up late at night, claiming to be from the diocese or federal liaisons. They would spend hours in the museum's basement, loading boxes of tapes and photographs into unmarked vans. Lorraine allegedly told her niece that she was forbidden to ask questions and that these men were cleaning up the evidence. When she pressed further, one of them told her, "You've already seen too much." What exactly was in those boxes remains unknown, but a handful of surviving assistants have revealed fragments of what they saw. Undeveloped film reels marked Amityville, unreleased, handwritten transcripts labeled Case, Fairfield, 1978, failed deliverance, and a small box of magnetic tapes labeled MK Field Study. Some now believe the Warrens' research crossed paths with classified military or psychological experiments that the government wanted kept secret. One investigator claims to have obtained a salvaged index sheet from 1990 listing over 50 unpublicized cases, including one codenamed Project Adramelech, which allegedly involved unidentified aerial anomalies and human contact. Whether these were fabrications, hoaxes, or genuine encounters, the documents disappeared within days of Ed's funeral. Adding to the mystery, the Warren Foundation, the organization responsible for archiving their legacy, has repeatedly declined to release its internal records, citing security and preservation concerns. Freedom of information requests filed by journalists have been stonewalled, and when one reporter asked a Foundation member if the missing materials were destroyed, they simply replied, "They are not destroyed. They're contained." Contained where? By whom? And why are so many people willing to risk their reputations to keep those files hidden? Whatever the truth is, the evidence points to one chilling possibility. The Warrens may have stumbled onto something real, something the world was never meant to see. After Lorraine Warren's death in 2019, a quiet meeting was reportedly held inside her Monroe, Connecticut home, one that witnesses witnesses later described as unlike anything the Warrens ever faced. The public was told it was a preservation review for the Warren Occult Museum, but leaked accounts reveal it was something else entirely. Late that night, black SUVs arrived in silence. Men in dark suits carried metal cases inside, alongside a priest and two government officials whose agency didn't exist on public record. Lorraine had left behind sealed boxes labeled "Do not open without clerical authority." One was placed on the table. When the lid lifted, the witnesses said the object inside, wrapped in black fabric, began to hum, faintly vibrating until the lights flickered out. The priest recited Latin prayers as one agent said, "We can't keep this here anymore." The item was rushed out and never seen again. Locals that night reported unmarked cars, strange equipment scanning the ground, and a brief power outage stretching across Monroe Turnpike. Days later, several attendees' contact information vanished. Phone numbers disconnected. Emails wiped. One former assistant claimed the object was the Vessel of Vera, an artifact the Warrens once said could not be destroyed. Weeks later, satellite data showed unexplained magnetic surges over the region. Officials called it coincidence. Paranormal researchers called it something else. The moment the seal broke,